And now, it's time for the Cannabis Reporter Radio Show with Snowden Bishop. Listen in as Snowden interviews cannabis industry pioneers, marijuana experts, policymakers, medical practitioners, patients, and other amazing individuals with compelling stories to share. It all happens right now. Here's the Cannabis Reporter, Snowden Bishop.
Evergreen is calling.
Hi, and welcome back to the Cannabis Reporter Radio Show. I'm Snowden Bishop. Thank you for joining us. As one of our nation's fastest growing sectors, it would seem that the cannabis industry is on the precipice of complete liberation from the confines of prohibition. With nearly every blue ticket presidential candidate advocating for federal legalization and public acceptance at an all-time high, marijuana policy reform is beginning to seem inevitable. With an economic upside that's hard to ignore, it's really no longer a matter of if, but when. But when happens to be a good question. Although business is thriving, it's not without a lot of regulatory challenges that no other industry has had to overcome. Banking, insurance, patient access, and standardization are just a few of the issues that stakeholders have had to work around on a daily basis. It's also subjected to a higher level of scrutiny than conventional businesses. But despite the extraordinary challenges, the industry is thriving and economic upside is becoming harder for lawmakers to ignore. Pro-cannabis measures like the STATES Act have been passed in Congress, but they have yet to see the light of day in the Senate. And until we have regulation to support the industry, stakeholders will continue to operate around the barriers. That's not really a bad thing, considering that the industry has, for the most part, policed itself on its own for greater good, but it is a double-edged sword. While the lack of regulation has allowed for untethered innovation, research, and development without the regulatory red tape of FDA oversight, it has also left room for bad actors to raise red flags that invite more scrutiny of critics. Take, for example, the recent news about the numerous deaths caused by tainted vape products, which could have been avoided had there been effective regulatory standards guiding manufacturing best practices. And even though the CDC hasn't identified a single culprit, and deaths were related to non-cannabis ingredients, the tragic events give anti-marijuana lobbies enough ammunition to shoot down legislation. That's the topic of today's show, and I'm excited to introduce our guest. Steve Shapiro is the founder and CEO of Superior Organics, one of the first Arizona-based companies to secure a license to own and operate a dispensary. Since then, his dispensary business has expanded to also include an edibles kitchen, extraction lab, and cannabis cultivation operation. He was a financial advisor for 25 years before entering the industry. And having studied cannabis and its history from an early age, Steve knew that the government wasn't truthful about cannabis, and he spent years collecting articles about it. In the mid-1990s, he had an opportunity to meet Jack Herer, whose book filled gaps of knowledge missing in his own research, and strengthened his resolve to pursue a path that would lead to his work in the industry. By the time the Arizona Medical Marijuana Act passed, he had already become an expert and was well prepared to open his first dispensary, and that happened in July of 2013. As a patient, he's experienced firsthand the therapeutic benefits of cannabis, and having lost friends and family to various health issues, he's convinced that cannabis could have helped them, if not saved their lives. Steve, thanks so much for joining me. I'm looking forward to this.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, you're certainly welcome. You know, I've been fascinated by your background because you spent so much time in finance, but I understand that when you were younger, you worked in a pharmacy, and you are now a dispensary owner. Tell me a little bit about how different that is from your experiences as a youth working in a pharmacy.
Sure. Well, I did work in a pharmacy back in high school. But in those days, I did read some of the pamphlets on the sides of the bottles, and was kind of amazed at the different side effects and complications of some of the most dangerous drugs that were being prescribed. Also, at the same time, I was learning about marijuana and always felt it was important to read up as much as I could on these different issues. And everything I was reading on marijuana or cannabis that was positive was coming from outside our country back in those days. You didn't see anything positive within the United States. No articles, no studies, no research. It told me that there must be something to the research that these other countries were finding. And over the years, I was lucky enough to meet Jack Ferrer out here in Arizona. He visited in '92 and spoke to Normal and introduced me to all the amazing things the hemp plant could do, as well as the rest of the picture of what marijuana could do. So we anxiously awaited these laws to change. Actually, our law passed in '96 the first time. The legislature just kind of said, no thanks. '97, here in Arizona, a man by the name of Tom Horn, he wrote something called the Voter Protection Act. His law protected us, supposedly. Well, in '98, there was another medical marijuana law passed here in Arizona. And that law said that the doctor could write a prescription on his pad. Federally, it's illegal to write a prescription for marijuana on the doctor's pad. And so that law kind of got negated, despite the Voter Protection Act. And it wasn't until 2010 that we really got it back on the ballot. And when we were voting on it, honestly, at the time, I did not believe this law would pass. Until I sat down with my parents about a month before the vote. We talked about it. They'd explained that they were going to vote for it, and I pretty much knew that. I had been convinced for a while at that point, but they told me all their friends were voting for it, for the medical bill. And I was quite surprised by that. And what my parents told me is they all talked about it, and they said, we've all seen this drug war not have any progress. And they were tired of seeing tax dollars thrown at a wasted drug war. Number two, they all knew their kids had tried marijuana, and the ones who'd stuck with marijuana, they turned out okay. And lastly, they looked at the list of what were the qualifying conditions. And they went around the table and they realized that in their little group right there, someone had seizures, Alzheimer's, chronic pain, chronic nausea. They almost covered the whole list of qualifying conditions just in their little group. And they said, we don't want the government telling us we can't use something if it might help us. And honestly, that was the moment my light bulbs kind of went off that this law was going to pass. Because if we had the support of the older generation, the vote was a shoo-in. Well, I was mistaken. My generation didn't vote for this. The 30 to 50-year-old crowd did not vote for this. But fortunately, the older generation did, and we won by 3,500 votes on that on Prop 203.
I remember that so vividly. It was such an amazing coup that it actually passed because you're right, it was sort of touch and go. I mean, there was a lot of question. And it's interesting that you mentioned Jack Herrer. I was going to ask you about that because meeting him must have been so inspiring. That man was so passionate about this issue. And I interviewed his son last year, Dan Herrer, and he told me a lot about growing up with Jack. He was a Korean War veteran who just felt completely betrayed by the government when he started learning about the positive benefits of cannabis, well, particularly hemp at first. Here he was fighting for our freedom, and the government is sitting here lying to people about something that really could be so beneficial, not just for human health, but also for the environment. So it's interesting. That must have been an amazing experience to meet him.
I completely related to him and everything you just said. His book, and I picked it up because I knew it was coming. I picked it up a few days before and read it. And it felt like home. In college, I used to collect these newspapers, and I would lift out the pot articles. I still have most of that file of all these pot articles, and these are some of the articles that I explained earlier that, you'd see stories from Spain, and it was helping people with pain or cancer out of Italy or whatever, or glaucoma or whatever it might be. It opened my eyes, and that's actually how I kind of convinced my parents as well, was to show them these stories. I did my own research. I was very excited to see this law would pass. Since then, as you know, in the state, there's been a lot of challenges, and unfortunately, but here we have an amazing medical marijuana program in Arizona for many reasons.
I mean, you were one of the first applicants to receive a license to do a dispensary at that time. And I know that there was so much opposition to it, but I can imagine that it might have been a challenge just wondering if there were going to be some issues with opening it because there was no protection on the federal level. And there were dispensaries that were being shut down just because the DEA was, still targeting states where they had passed legislation. Tell me about some of the experiences you had back then.
It was a little scary at first. We made sure to follow all the rules. We felt, fortunately, where we opened in Superior, which is a small mining town here in Arizona, there's about 3,000 people up there, a real charming little town. It's real pretty. And fortunately, we seemed to have the support of the local police and the local government up there. We did a really good job of working with them. When I first showed up in 2012, I came to town. They needed help figuring out the zoning a little bit, so I met with the city and tried to explain to them that, look, if they don't set up zoning rules, the dispensary can go anywhere. And it wasn't actually until the week of applications that city put their zoning rules together. So I had to scramble really quick when we did our application to get everything done. It was a lot of challenges back then, but there were concerns about traveling when you're bringing wholesale product into the store. You definitely went the speed limit or less. You didn't push it, that's for sure. Because in the first month or two, even the local police, the state police, they didn't know the program very well. And so you might be at the mercy of an officer who didn't know the program in the first couple of months. And that was a little scary for some people. So it took some time to get past that. Now there's still some challenges. I mean, you still, I think as a patient or an employee or an owner, you should be very aware of Prop 203, the law, the regulation, and the rules that the state put out so that you don't ever have a problem.
Yeah. Well, and patients too. We've had our share of issues there.
For sure.
Like the Rodney Jones case, for example.
For sure. Well, yeah. Oh, absolutely. No, absolutely. Yeah. And there are a few others as well, though. I remember the student at ASU.
Yep.
That was a tragedy.
Oh, it was. It really was.
One of the stories that we're proud of up actually in Superior was there was a woman that was a grandma actually that was taking care of her grandchildren. And someone decided that because she had her card, she wasn't qualified to be the custodian for these grandchildren. And fortunately, our law protects that. It doesn't allow discrimination like that. And we were able to help her twice prove it in the courts to keep the family together.
That's great. So looking at the landscape right now, challenges that are still facing Arizona, I know there's a lot going on in the legislature right now to sort of expand upon the original Prop 203 that passed here. There have been a lot of legislative measures here in State House. Some have gone through, some haven't. But what are some of the challenges that you think dispensary owners in this state are facing right now?
I think the biggest one, and the one that really concerns me as we look at recreational, or I like to call it social use, actually.
That's a good term, actually, social use.
Yeah, you don't go recreationally drinking. You socially or use it as adults.
Right.
To me, one of the biggest issues is banking. As we go and look towards social or adult use, without solving the banking issue, we're going to create even more problems. Currently, it is legal for the banks to do business with us. We are legal and legitimate businesses. In 2014, Eric Holder, President Obama, put guidance in to the banking rules. Not law change, but guidance in, saying if they are operating open, operating, and compliant, feel free to do business with them.